My name is Pat Miller. I'm a member of the Liddle family, and we're here to share some of our life stories. The other thing is that I'd like to get Christy Bloomfield, one of our emerging leaders for our family, to come up and do the Welcome to Country. Thank you.
Ora, Aritna Christy Bloomfield, Central Aranda, Eastern Aranda, Aliauda, Mparntwe in Mparntwe. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Christy Bloomfield. I'm a traditional owner of Mparntwe, Alice Springs. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge our elders, past and present, and our emerging leaders. I'd also like to acknowledge that the native title determination by the Federal Court was made in 1999. That native title was recognised here in Mparntwe, Ilkma, and Andulia. Like Anne said, Central Aranda people have always welcomed people to our country, and today is no difference. On behalf of the traditional owners, welcome to Annie Pat and Uncle Tony's Living History Stories. Thank you.
First of all, thanks everybody for coming along. I was minding my own business as usual, and I gave it to Zane's, and sitting up at Zane's house in the lounge was Brother Tony, Anne, and Zania. And so I started to include myself in the conversation, and they said, "Well, what about you?" I said, "What about me?" And they said, "Well, why don't you join Tony?" I said, "Doing what?" And they said, "Coming along and have it." I said, "No, you'll be right." And he said to me, "No, come on, Pat." So how could I say no to my older brother? But before I give him the mic to tell us about his life, I just want to say something. With all my brothers, they've been so kind, hard-working people with much respect for the women in our family, especially Mum. And Tony, of all people, whenever he got paid, that's when he got paid, because sometimes Uncle didn't pay him, and he used to come home and iron his money. And me and Mum would look, he's got a £5 note. And we'd say, I wonder if he's going to share it. So he'd iron it and press it and fold it, and we never saw it again. And then whenever we wanted to go to pictures, he'd say, look, I've got £5 here, but it's only £5 I've got. So make sure you make it last. But I'd like to hand over to Tony now to tell us about his life.
Stand up. All right, I can sit down, that's okay. I'm talking about £5 notes. First time I looked like getting one, I got picked in the Alice Springs school team to go to Darwin. And I came back with a letter and I showed it to Dad. And he's reading it right through, and at the end of it, it said that'll be £25 to pay up to go on the thing. And after Dad finished reading it, he said, where am I going to get £25 from? He said, you better go out and get a job. So he sent me over to Uncle Harold's, who had a brickwork going in hey? Yeah, anyway, he sent me over there, and Uncle Harold got me working there. This is about a month or more before that. So I worked all that time before I got paid, and I said to Dad, I said, oh, I need that money. He said, well, you better go and get the money off of Harold. You were working for him. So I went over there and I said to Uncle Harold, I need that money to get on the bus. And he said, he had it all there anyway. He gave it to me, and that was good. I went all the way to Darwin with it. And I met a bloke in Darwin when I was a kid at Danger's Downs, I was about 5 or 6 years old, and they were talking about, Dad was talking about one of his brothers that had been taken away from there and sent up to Darwin and ended up on the islands. And that was Alfie Liddle. And when I got to Darwin, because Alfie hadn't been back since he was a kid that was taken away, and then Darwin was only a small place then. There was 1955, and Alfie come looking for me at the place. He said, there's a Liddle. He said, oh, have you got one of the Liddles staying here? He said, it could be one of my relations. And it turned out that when I went to see him, where they dropped me off, found out that was Dad's brother. So, after all them years. So Dad was happy to hear that. And then he ended up coming down to see old Grandpa when old Grandpa Liddle left Angus Downs and that. And he started coming backwards and forward, and they got together again. So it was a good thing that old Grandpa looked after all these kids. He was a Scotsman, like his father was a Scotsman, and he was born in Anguston in South Australia. That's why Angus Downs got that name out there, the station, which Dad and Uncle Arthur ended up buying off him. But it was a good thing that it made a good place for us growing up out there, like all sorts of things, working on the station. Like when you were 7 or 8 year old, you started doing something for yourselves, and that's why when I left school at 16, and then couldn't get a job them days, no thing. And then Dad sent me out. He said, "Oh, I found a job for you." He said, "You can go out to Alcuda Station with Bill Turner." So he sent me out there to work for a while. And that was a good thing, though, a good way of learning a lot of things from people, Aboriginal people that worked out there, because Dad worked there in the 30s, and he knew a lot of the old Aboriginal people there. And they came up as soon as they found out who I was, and they sort of claimed me and spoke to me and told me a lot of things that I learned about Aboriginal people, and how they feel about families and all that. So it was a good thing that they looked after me, and all that time they were afraid that I might get thrown off a horse or something might be done, something bad. And they showed me the country in case you get lost if you're chasing horses through the scrub and everything. And they always tell you the ranges are over there, and from there to homesteads over there, so that you don't get lost. So they tell you every little thing that I know, which was really good, And I learned a lot there, and came back into town. I started working for Dad. And when I got into town for our break from Alcuda, I saw Bobby driving one of Dad's trucks when he started off carrying rations out to all the missions there, all the settlements. And I said, "Oh, I want to come back and drive one of them trucks." So anyway, I went out and stayed out there for a few more months, and then came back into town, and started driving for Dad. And the first thing he did was send me out to Harts Bluff. I could drive then, and went out there, but I knew how to drive and all that, but I didn't know much about fixing cars. So when I got to about 10 mile away from Harts Bluff, the truck broke down, and we walked into there then, and Dad and Barb, Pat, and all, they all come out looking for us. They thought, "Oh, we'll meet them halfway." Well, I was right there at Harts Bluff, and Dad had to drive all the way to Harts Bluff with all his mobs sitting in the back. And, because it was a Sunday. Anyway, they end up coming out there, and Dad fixed it up in about 5 minutes. And after, it was an easy little thing, the points on the distributor and that, and he just wiped him a little bit, and then away we went. And I thought, "Oh, goodness, I better start watching it." He always says, "Just look, don't ask questions, just look what you're doing and see what you're doing." And that's how I learned how to do all that sort of thing. And, I started doing all that and fixing things myself, just copying him. And when I went over to Transport and Works, where I stayed for about 31 years, I started there from 1960 to 91, I think, right? Yeah, before I left there. But driving all over the territory between here and Darwin and all over the territory, point wherever you like. And I've been there at one time or another, taking things out for graders and things as we're doing all the roads away from Alice Springs. Every part of it I went to, just about. And Dickie Bella was out and with you, probably know him, remember him. But we didn't get along all the time that I was there in that 31 years. And right at the end of it, where they were transferring men out when they were closing the place down, when they were transferring men out to different government jobs. And then because I didn't have I was only a truck driver. I couldn't get a job and they couldn't transfer me anywhere. So they decided, Dickie Bella said to me, he said, you need to leave or we'll sack you at the end of it, because he didn't want me to get the payment or something. And then one thing led to another, and I went in to see Tony Miller in the office, and he said, well, he can't sack you. So I stuck on there until the end of it when it all finished. And I got the payout of that at that time for not being able to be transferred to anywhere. But it was all pretty hard to take, them sort of things. Look, it was good working at the government. I enjoyed driving all over the country, out to Giles, weather station. My old mate, he seen us go past this the rock, plenty of times, pulled up at his pub and had a beer. Yeah, so we all knew each other pretty well, yeah. And I promised that I'd give him a photo of the Ayers Rock and a windmill and tank that me and Ian Lovegrove put up there. You probably, a lot of you know Ian Lovegrove. So, first of all, I was working with, forget the old bus driver, bloody. Len Chewett. So he sent me out there then, and Ian Lovegrove, I worked with Ian Lovegrove for about 3 months. We was out there putting up that windmill and doing a few other things. And old Bill Harney was there. That's where I met old Bill Harney. And I first met the bloke that was in charge of transport and works here. I forget his name now, but he's seen me driving the tractor that Ian brought over. And he said to me, he said, oh, if you can drive machinery like that, he said, we'll be looking for a lot of men because we'll be putting a road through to the rock. He said, we were putting a road through there. And I went there and after Ian brought me back into town, and I went to Transport and Works, and they gave me a job straight away. And that lasted all the 31 years. It was seemed a long time, but getting to see every part of the country and meeting a lot of people all over the place, station owners and that, there was nobody in them places. There was only a few people there, you know. And really, when you pulled up at them places, because the roads used to go straight past the homesteads, and I always pulled up there, and they come in and offer you, you know, a feed or something on your way through. That's how people were in them days. I don't know what they're like today. You just go flying straight past because the roads are a bit further away from the homestead then. But they were good times, yeah. I can't think of much more to say right now, but Pat looks like she wants to say something. Yeah. Back to me.
I think he's selling himself short when he's talking about, you know, I just did it and I just did that. This man went by himself on a big semi-trolley where he used to take all the equipment for the people who worked on the roads, like the prime mover. He had the front end loader, he had the whatever it was. So the semi-trailer was as long as the ones you see now, and he used to load it and unload it by himself. And he travelled to those remote areas by himself. There was no such thing as, you know, HR or health and safety. And, you know, they even wanted him to go in the night and drive. So there's some photos that we've got of some of the photos that he took, because he was a avid camera, used to love to take photos. And his first job with Uncle Harold, he got himself a Brownie camera. So he's got photos from Priest Street taken right back to the gap when there were no houses except the runway for Conair and just a few houses dotted around. So with that camera, he took it out to Alcuta, and often that's where he first met Charlie McAdam and Frankie Burns, as WA bringers that had come over here and started working with Uncle Bill Turner. And then Tony had this camera, and whenever they were out in the stock work and doing, he'd give it to Charlie to take a photo, or Frankie. And in Frank Burns's book, most of the photos that were supplied by Tony. In the 50s, those photos were taken. So it's sort of like a history of your life. But now he wants to talk. Come on. We're just doing this by trial now.
So, well, you got the photo up there. I'm just going to tell you, this was one of Dad's trucks. It was one of the old government trucks, International. And when I came back from Alcuda Station, I started working for Dad, cutting wood. And that's Johnny Spencer up the top there, and myself there. That was taken in 1957 when I come back here from Alcuda. And that's what Dad had, and we used to cut that mulga wood up like that so we could pack it up like that. But they had to be pretty tightly stacked, otherwise it slips one way or the other. It'll just sort of move, but we went along fairly. That's up near McGrath's Flat and that. You know where that is? Yeah, up past there. And these are only 2 logs at the back here, but then we put some what's named in there to hold it. But they were all good trucks. Dad bought all these second-hand trucks and that just to cover that. But there was no gas or electrical stoves or anything. Them days only the wood. So that's why we did so much of it all that year. But then as time went on, the only time they sold wood after that was when the winter was on, because everybody started getting gas and all that sort of thing. So I don't know whether there's another photo. Yeah. Oh, this one here was Dad when we were out cutting wood and everything. That's Bobby on the side there, on the right, and tourists that they took out in that little van there, combi van, and these Aboriginal people here. This at Mount Ebenezer, as they were going through, and Dad just got hold of them and talked to them because he could talk language and everything to these people, and he just lined them up with things and took photos of them. But a lot of them he knew, because a lot of them came through from Angus Downs when we were there, and he knew everybody and he could talk language and everything to them. So they'd just stand up there and get a photo taken without any trouble at all. That was at Mount Ebenezer Station when they were going through, the place that Harold Liddle had. He'd sold out by then, and Ted Cunith had taken it over. But and then Uncle Harold went into a lot of other things. After he left, he had Mount Ebenezer originally, Uncle Harold did, and then he moved around. After he left there, he came into town and he took up a brickworking thing. First of all, he had did a lot of contracts around town, and he used to always pick me up in the morning. Not that I wanted to go, because I'd be laying in bed, and he'd come over early in the morning. And he asked Mum, is any of the boys there? And she said, oh, only one's here is Tony. And then he comes through and he said, Tony, get up. He said, what are you doing? And I was still half asleep, and I was going, don't worry about it. He said, come on, you can come with me. So we'd go out and started doing contracts in the airstrip and all over the place. And then he started a brickwork up there, and I stayed with him after school. That's how I ended up paying my fare to Darwin with the school football team. You know, working, and it was a good thing, because I was making my own money, and I never ever got money off Mum and Dad after that. Always got money, and then paid for everything myself. So it was pretty good that they put me on like that, you know. So I don't know whether there's another photo coming up or not. There. That one there. This is the thing we put up at me and Ian Lovegrove. I went out there when I was working for Len Hewitt. He sent me out. And Len said, "Oh, we've got a man out at that's going to put up a windmill and tank for us." He said, "Ian Lovegrove." Well, I knew Ian from Alice Springs. Yeah? I was only a kid then when I first knew him, because he used to ride around on a motorbike with Charlie Wright and all them fellas. I see them when they were kids, when they were young men, I mean. And then I came down here and I met him, and we put that up. Took us a while to put all that with the stuff coming in and out. And but I was there for a while. But about 3 months I ended up staying there. Met old Bill Harney. He was there with us. And when the footy season, when the tourist season was over, we ended up finishing that off then. And there was only a few of us there left, because everybody had gone by then. This here is a photo taken at Hatches Creek, at the 8 Mile Hatches Creek. And that's one of the hazes on that side, and that's Mum standing the second one there, holding Bobby. That's the 8 Mile water. I don't know whether you've ever been that way. That's up in the Devonport Ranges, up there. And that motor car was given to Dad when he started working for Bill Walsh, because he was so good at everything that he wanted done, and he bought him that car and took it up to him. And then when he left there and came back to Alice Springs, this is just when the war and that's started. And then he said when he left, and the mine and everything, the mine and Wolfram and all that sort of thing. But when he left there, he said, when he left there, he said, I had nearly nothing. He said, all I had was a motor car, a wife and 2 kids. That's me and Bobby. Yeah. So he had a good sense of humour anyway. And Mum came down, because she's a Yawara woman from up that side in the Devonport Ranges, and that's where me and Bobby was born. But she came down and she stayed here in Alice Springs and out at Angus Downs with all the Lurija Pujinara people, you know. She got to know everybody. She could talk with them as well. But Dad could talk all those languages too. Because when he went to the bungalow, taken away from what's name down there, when he was about 3 or 4 years old, and they brought him down and put him in the first bungalow, him and a lot of other kids. And the older girls that were there, because they didn't have an education or anything, they could still talk a bit of English, but they mainly spoke language all the time. And that's where Dad learned how to talk Central Arundel from there, you know, all the people there. And then wherever he went, he could talk all them languages, you know, to people. And he helped a lot of people. Oh, that's one of the trucks that I drove when I was with Transport and Works. And they'd send me out on my own to load all that machinery on its own, until another fellow that came in there was Bruce Staines. You probably know him. Yeah. Well, he came they came from Ildunda station, the Staineses, and Bruce, well, he gave that up and he came into truck driving. But I taught him a lot how to load all this stuff. It's a lot easier to drive a truck, but when you've got to put machinery on there and back all them trailers up, hook them up, it's a pretty hard job, you know. But it was a good job. I liked it. There's good money in it. And you're away from everybody else, the bosses and everything. You just take your time and you do things. Oh, God. That was getting ready for one of my fights. Hey? That's I was getting ready to fight a bloke from Mount Isa, in the youth centre here, and it was the centenary year, 1960. So I think all that was everything was done that year. There was a lot of things going on, and they couldn't get anybody in the territory to fight me, so they brought a bloke over from Mount Isa, and luckily I ended up beating him. Never mind. Because Bobby, I took over Bobby, because Bobby, my brother, he went away from me in 1958, and he went down to turn professional, because he did a lot of amateur boxing like that as well. So, and he ended up going down to and turning professional. 1 year down there, I went 1962, I think it was, and he sent me a telegram to if I could go down and see the fight at Festival Hall in Melbourne. I don't know whether you've heard all about that. Festival Hall. And these here, my old grandmother on that side, on the left-hand side there. That was Dad's mother. And the Espy family, Edie Espy and Edie Powell, that old girl at the back, and this is old Granny's sister, Rosie Spencer. They had Tea Tree Hotel that, they got it there, and then before Uncle Harold started up the other one across the road. That was in the early 1960s that was taken. But they also did a lot, these women, like all you see, people see a picture there, but they don't realise how much these women have done over that time. They're very hard-working women, but you don't hear much about them. So whenever I see this photo, I always think of the things that they've done and not really recognised for. The men that they were with, they got all the recognition about everything, but they were there without them women. Those men wouldn't have survived. This one is Hartley Street School, 1952. Yeah, that's me there. Yeah. And I still remember that jumper because I went to school with no jumper and I was freezing, and Mum happened to come there at lunchtime sometime, and I said, "Oh, I'm freezing," because I didn't get this one when we were at St Mary's. Most of the kids there are Aboriginal kids there that are some of the St Mary kids. And that was taken out where the car park is now from the old thing, yeah. I don't know. I still recognise a lot of those people there. Seems a long time. Oh, that's old Grandpa Liddle, old Bill Liddle. He was at the telegraph station here. I mean, not telegraph station. When he came into town, that's taken probably out at the old, what they call the old sheep camp. And we weren't out there 1948, I think he left there when he came into town. And he gave it up because he'd sold the place to his two sons, Uncle Arthur Liddle and Dad. And Uncle Harold had already taken up a vacant block, which was Mount Ebenezer. He'd taken that up. He sort of picked that place because before he went away in the army in the Second World War, and he came back and then took that place up then. And but they all got along pretty well. Old Grandpa, he taught a lot of his three sons. He taught them a lot of things when they left, because when they were taken away from the bungalow, they were sent up to other stations to work. Like Dad, he went away, and he'd written a letter to the people in charge there, if they could. Old Grandpa said if he could take them out when they finished their education. But the bloke said, "No, you're not taking him." He said, "You didn't pay for your education, so you can't have him." And so they sent him away somewhere else. And it was a terrible thing. All they had to do was say, he waited until he was about 21. You had to stay there until you were 21, those kids. But he eventually caught up with his father when Dad was working for Lackman Agency here. And they happened to just bump into Grandpa there, and he asked him if he wanted to go down to Angus Downs, and that's how they ended up down there. So they worked pretty hard. They were on camels, then they were taken when they only had sheep there. Old Grandpa had sheep there, and they'd get all the wool and everything together and take them down on the camel down the railhead, and they did all that. They worked pretty hard in there while I was still at that age, Oh, this is all of us there. Mum and Dad, and the rest of us there. Mum sitting there. But probably after Dad passed away, yeah. No, we got on pretty well with our parents. They've had no trouble. Yeah, so that's why I think we sort of got along a little bit, because of the way Dad treated us. And he'd never get nasty with you. You know, he'd just say something and you just took notice, and that was it. Yeah. Mum couldn't read and write, but because they didn't get any schooling down there. But Dad, like, he learnt a lot from going to grade 4 and then moving on. He helped so many Aboriginal people here that couldn't do anything because a lot of them weren't educated, but because he knew all the languages and he spoke to lawyers and everybody and ministers and so on. And he ended up doing a lot of that just to help people. He'd go out of his way to help somebody. So he's pretty well known at that time. Yeah. At the last one. What? I'll turn it over to Pat again. She'll have something to say.
If we weren't in public, Tony. Yeah, look, just following on from what Tony was talking about, we grew up in an era of, the assimilation policy, where you weren't allowed to speak language, even though language was always spoken in the house and home. You actually got caned if you were heard in the schoolyard speaking your language. We could understand when people walked past, they'd yell out and talk to us, but we never answered back. So today we can all understand our language, but we cannot speak fluently. And I think the brain tells you if you go down that path, you're going to get into trouble. So at home, Granny, Mum, and all the aunties that come by often spoke language and never spoke English. And then once we left that yard, it was the Queen's English. You had to speak proper English. And believe it or not, I often topped the class with English. And people thought that I'd cheated. But I wasn't going to get caned, where I witnessed other children getting the cane for speaking language in the playground. But having said that, as Tony was saying, Mum had come from country. She was born at Grundy Station, northeast of here. She was a Liddle woman who Dad met at Hatches Creek. She was working in the police station, and Dad was one of the miners up there. They used to mine for a thing called wolfram and mica. And then they'd stayed up there for a number of years, and he came down with 2 little boys, and they stayed on the bank of the creek where the CWA Hall is, where Monty's is now. And there was a big tent where all the part Aboriginal people stayed. And this day that they arrived, the rain had come and there was a big quagmire. And he said to Uncle Walkup Tilmouth, look, we can't be living like this with all the kids. Why don't you come with me and we'll go and see Bill McCoy and Dee Dee Smith? And he said, oh, no, you go ahead. He said, I'll wait and look after their families. And so down the street he goes and he met an old man called Bill Bray, who was the grandfather of all the Bray family. So he and Bill Bray went to speak with Dee Dee Smith and Bill McCoy. You know, you've got to build proper accommodation for us. We can't be living like this. So that's how the cottages was formed. And the cottages was right down where the Gap View Hotel is. And I think there was something like 20 dwellings, and they both had 2 units on either side. And most of the part Aboriginal kids grew up at the cottages. But when it was time to pick up the keys for our house, Dad goes down there and they're all getting their keys, and they said, oh, you can't get a key, Milton. Why not? Well, you're a quarter caste and your wife's a full blood. It's only for half caste people, even though his brothers and sisters would go because they were they were brown-skinned people. So the policies were absolutely shocking. So they said to him, you can go out to Angus Downs. Your father's got accommodation out there for you. And from our point of view, that was the best thing that happened to us growing up at the station and having such a free life. And then we'd come into town to go to school, and we'd always get picked up early and come back to school late. So we loved that. We'd have extra days holiday. But just saying that, I was the last in the family at the time, and all the other kids were going to school in the convent. They were boarders. So when it was time for me to go to school, we'd gone and saw the Mother Superior, and I couldn't believe how shiny the floors in the presbytery were. Unbeknown to me at the time, it was the children that kept those floors shiny. And they had this red sort of sulphur cement. And anyhow, the next day they said, "Who do you know at the school?" And I said, "Oh, I know my cousin Jenny Ross, who was David Ross' sister. All right, Jenny will meet you tomorrow when the bell rings. She'll take you to your class." And so I go to school the next day. I'm sitting the third boy, girl. And the nun had this chart up with all these pretty pictures on it. And she also had a long stick in her hand pointing to the pictures. And then she said, she called them down one at a time. And then she said to me, "Come on down." So I go down. And I was thinking, what were those kids saying? And they said, "A is for." And all I was seeing was this red fruit. But I'd never seen a ripe or fresh apple, because we'd station kids. We had dried currants, dried this, dried that. Never ever seen, we've seen oranges and lemons because they grew around town, saw grapes. And she said, "A is for." So I looked at it and I said, "Fruit." So I got a whack for that across the legs. And I thought, no, I'm not going to cry. So she said that twice. Then she goes, "B is for." Now, my brothers never had played cricket or baseball or whatever. They rode horses, donkeys, goats, and they worked. And their pastime was, galloping around and, getting bush tucker. So when she said B is for, I say, "Stick." So she whacked me again. And by this time I was thinking, "Oh, what is it? What is it?" So she said, "B is for." So I said, "Stick." I got another, and she said, "Get to your seat." So I went to the seat and I'm rubbing my legs, but what hurt me the most was that she never asked me what that third one was, because we had plenty of cats at home and I would have got that right. And I'll never forget that, because that nun she had such an angelic face and pretty blue eyes. Don't know what colour hair she had because she had the habit on. And I was telling Sister Barbara and Sister Mary O'Connell over at Addison Matthew one day when we went out for lunch. And I'm telling them this yarn about this sister. And I said, "Sister Augustine was her name." And Sister Barbara had a real strong Irish accent. She says, "Oh, Pat, I must say, I'll have to disagree with you there, because it wasn't Sister Augustine. It was Sister Augustine." And I said, "Never mind." I said, "As far as I'm concerned, she was Sister Augustine because she was disgusting." and she said, "Well, fair enough, poor old thing." And so that was my introduction to an education. So they said, "When the bell rings, you can go out and have a drink of water and play." But when that bell rang, I took off across the Anzac Oval. There was no lawn there then. Straight across the paddock where the boys played football, straight across and ran down Chewing Street where we lived in an old shack next to Marty Gardner's house. And I got onto the bed, crawled under the bed. The first part of the house had cement and some rough gravel work, but the rest of where we slept had creek sand. And every morning, Granny and Mum would rake the creek sand up. So old Granny tracked me. She could see this kid's track. And she's saying in language to my mum, "That kid's there somewhere." No, she's at school. No, she's here, look." And when Mum saw the the red marks across my legs. She got fighting mad, and there's two weapons that an Aboriginal woman used to use, is a nulla nulla and a kutra. And a kutra is a little short fighting stick. So Mum grabbed her kutra and she was going down to sort the nun out. And then poor old Granny was yelling out her in language, "Don't go to police will come, you'll get put in jail, rah, rah." So she convinced Mum that wasn't the right thing to do. So anyhow, lo and behold, about an hour later, Dad pulls up in the old army blitz that he had. It was like we was on the telephone, but we weren't. And anyhow, she's telling Dad, so he said, so she threw me into the blitz, and I went back to the station for 2 more years. And I didn't go to the school until I was about 7, to Hartley Street School. So he pulled all the kids out of the convent, and that's where the boys went to St Mary's, because we had no accommodation at home. And Barb come back and stayed with us in Chewing Street. But at the Hartley Street School, that was the best experience that I've ever come across. We had a beautiful teacher there called Miss Maloney, who later became Mrs Maury Johns. And she was one of the nicest ladies that I've ever come across. And she listened to the children, and she really understood where we were coming from, because there was no preschool for Aboriginal kids. We just more or less come straight from the sand hills straight into school. So it was a big learning curve for all of us. But in grade 2, I had this beautiful teacher called Rona Glynn. Now, Rona Glynn was also related to us, and she was just a magnificent lady, and she taught grade 2s on one side, and a lady called Mrs Krantz taught grade 3s on the other side. So she says to the class, "Now, if you sit up straight, you might get an early minute." Well, I think I sat up the straightest because I felt this real soft hand on my head. So she said, "If I touch your head, you can leave." So she put the hand on my head, and away I went. And that's the only early minute I ever got. It was from Rona. So I loved that lady. So she lasted about a year, and then she went away to do nursing. She came back to Alice Springs a few years later as a triple certificate nursing sister, and she was also qualified in midwifery. She delivered here in Alice Springs over 2,000 babies, and we've got a preschool that's named after her over the east side. But the other thing is that the saddest part about it, when that beautiful woman had her first child, it took her life as well as the babies. And so it's very sad that we no longer have Rona in our midst, but there's a legacy that lady left and really affected all of us. So she was just the most beautiful person that was loved by everybody that knew her. So that was my introduction to Hartley Street. And then in that system, going to school, we also had to make sure we lived under what they call daylight till dark. There was a law that Aboriginal people could not be out before 6 and had to be home by 6. So it was 6 till 6. And because Mum and Granny couldn't tell the time, they say to us kids, "You make sure that you're home before dark." And one other thing was, and don't go over there and eat their food. And I was thinking, but they got lovely food. Why aren't we allowed to eat their food? But it wasn't until years later. If you eat their food, it means you're taking food out of their kids' mouths. So you make sure to come home and have a feed. And so that was the rule that Dad always set. And one of his rules was, whenever we had a meal, we all had to sit down and nobody was allowed to talk. He did all the talking, and you had to make sure that you listened. So 6 o'clock was news time, so we all knew what was going on around the world and what the news was about. And the only paper that I'd ever seen there was the Adelaide Advertiser and a book called the Chronicle, which was the prices of sheep and cattle. So we never had all the pretty pictures. There was no Women's Weekly or Women's Day or the Post at that stage. But when I moved to high school, I was in art, and the teacher said, "Pat, I'd like you to stay back." And I said, "Oh, what have I done now? Probably talking too much." And then anyhow, I go and wait back to her, and she said, I said, "Yes, Miss Steer." And she said, "Pat, there's the CWA Spring Flower Show coming on." And I was thinking, we've got no flowers at home. We've got sunflowers. We've got nothing that anybody would want to take a photo of. And then she said, I want you to enter into the poster competition for the CWA Spring Flower Show, September something like. So I entered in it and I won it. And she said, a couple of weeks later, she said, Pat, you won that Spring Flower Show poster competition. I said, really? She said, you can go down to Gorry's shoe store on the corner of Gorry's Arcade. The envelopes will be there and you get the first prize. So after school, I'll go down and there's this lady in there, it was a Mrs. Gorry, and she said to me, what do you want? And I said, I've come to pick up my prize money for the Spring Flower Show competition. And she looked at me, then she looked at the envelopes and went through this little box. And then she looked back at me, she said, what's your name? And I told her. Then she looked back at me and she said, there you go. And as I'm walking down the street, I looked at the money and it was the third prize money. And I thought, I didn't want to go back and cause a problem because I didn't know who she was. But if it was Mrs. Gorry, I would have told her. So I went home and I said, Dad, I got first prize. I won first prize. And he said, yeah. I said, but they only gave me third prize money. I said, what do you think I should do? He said, don't worry about it. Let them keep their money. We don't need it. And I felt like saying, yes, I do. But it's a lesson to be learned, you know. People were judging you and shortchanging you. And so you just got on, as Tony said, a lot of things happened to us growing up. But one thing we did have is a strong family connection. Whenever we went on holidays, when Uncle Harold was building Tea Tree Roadhouse, Dad said, right, we're all going up to Tea Tree for a holiday. And when he said something, everybody took notice. So there was our 6 kids, Uncle Harold's 10 kids, Uncle Arthur's 3 kids. So there were 17 or 18 kids, all doing different things at different times, you know, riding the donkeys. Some were working in the garden with Uncle Harold. And he had really green fingers. He had like a big market garden and citrus fruits growing. And if you wanted to eat between meals, you often went into the garden and stole the tomatoes. But then you had to look up at this 6'5" gentleman. What do you got there? Nothing, Uncle Harold. And there's all these tomatoes around my waist because I'd tied the belt up. I didn't have any pockets. But what a gentle giant he was, you know, we just loved him. And all the brothers got on and they made sure, even today, we've got so much love and respect for one another. Our kids are being brought up in the same manner. And don't forget where you come from and don't forget the elders. That's why I like being at my age now, because I've got all my malpas over there that help me. But it wasn't easy growing up. It was tough. But what we did have is care and compassion. When you look at what's happening in our society today, everybody is talking about these kids that are running amok, but we're not talking to them. They've got to be restricted and confined and sat down and made to listen. You know, there's a lot of people saying, well, what are the parents doing? Well, what are they doing? You know, there's all these different agencies around town that are purporting to do this and do that, but we, the people of the town, we can't see anything happening that's saying, well, there's change coming. The other day I was down at the back of the Hartley Street School, park waiting for Sister Barb to come back around from doing her banking, and there was a tradie parked in front of me, and I'm behind the tradie, and there's a little nature strip, and I'm looking at my phone, I looked up, and there were 10 8 and 10-year-old boys surrounding this tradie. 2 or 3 had hopped on the back of his ute, and he reached over and locked his car, and then he started to blow his horn to try and frighten them off. But they lifted up the lid of the esky, got a couple of drinks out. I don't know whether it was water or whatever that young fella had in his esky. And then he started his car up and sort of roared off. And they threw a couple of cans at him. And I sat there thinking, well, I'm not going to be a hero today. I never thought I'd be cautious of 10-year-old kids. And anyhow, there was nobody around, just me in my car and this young fella. And then I was seeing Barb's white hair coming along, and I thought, they're going to they'll probably steal her bag off her. But what they did was run off towards Flynn Church. And I said, get in the car, quick, we'll lock the car. She said, why? And I said, well, all those kids over there are on a rampage. And I said, I've got no idea what tribal group they come from because they were too fast and I didn't speak to them. And she said, I would have given what for? And I said, no, you got to err on the side of caution these days because they are so cheeky and they are so disrespectful. And I think we all got to be careful of where we go and what we do. But why are we being held ransom today and not go about our everyday lives? And the local people are absolutely sick of it. It's not my business, or it's not your business not to do anything. I think the town have got to combine now to really make an effort. And there's people that are on radio and on TV saying, you've got to think of colonisation, you've got to think of that. There's nothing we haven't lived through and we've survived. And there's nothing that we haven't done inside the law where we have abided and lived as good citizens. And what has gone out the door is respect. So I think they've got to go back to square one with a lot of families and a lot of people and stop spoiling people. We grew up in a household that had a yes and a no, a do and a don't, and a right and a wrong. No grey areas, no ifs, buts. As Tony said, Dad said, I've got a job for you. You're leaving tomorrow. He rolled his wagon head, no backhand, and he enjoyed it, and he worked hard too. And so we all come from that sort of background. And in our family now, we're very proud to say we've just had Lorraine's two sons graduate as doctors, so they work here in Alice Springs. It's in the medicine area. We've got a pilot. You may not know Jamie. He's our pilot. We've got 3 lawyers in our family. We've got a lot of admin staff. So we've got kids that are educated so they can have a quality of life. My little granddaughter, I'd never ever seen a report with straight A's. And I said to her, your grandpa would be very proud of you, Alex, because he just loves his grandkids. So, and then she got another set of straight A's. So on Friday at Unley High School, that little 14-year-old is going to get an award for academic excellence. And I can watch that online. So I'm feeling very proud. But as you know, my husband loved his grandchildren. But he was also a hard-working man. He was a water driller, as Dave would know. Where did Dave Evans go? Over there. And also Tony knew him really well. He was one of his good mates and he really respected and loved Tony. So thank you, Tony, for being his mate. But that's a handsome Harry photo, that one. But he, like Tony, used to drive the big drilling rigs, and go out for weeks on end. And so while he was away, I was home for about 7 years before I got back into employment. And I was walking down the street and I met a past work colleague. He said, Pat, what are you doing? And I said, I'm looking for a job. He said, I've got one for you. He said, come down the airport. I police the airport canteen. I said, doing what? And he said, selling pies and pasties and that. I said, Ron, I won't be able to do these. Why not? I said, I've been home for 7 years using words of one syllable. Put that away, don't hit him, come over here. I said, how can I serve customers? He said, you'll be right. So anyhow, he said, there's a lady down there called Mrs. Garner, Peg. She said, you'll get on well with her. Well, what happened was Peg Garner and Harold Garner were people who lived in Darwin for many years, and they'd come down here from after Cyclone Tracy and made Alice Springs their home. So Harold Garner started up the community college and Peg was working at the airport canteen with Ron. So I got along with Peg and I used to go to their house nearly every Sunday for a cuppa. And it was Mr. Garner that said, come back to school. I've got this community college opening. So I went back and did a business degree and, brushed up on typing and did a few things like that. And then I applied for the public service. and got into the CSIRO, but at the same time, Aboriginal Affairs had started, and there was a man in charge of hostel who'd come from Victoria, Aboriginal man, and he said to my dad, "What's your daughter doing down at the airport canteen selling pies and pasties? She should be working for one of these organisations. We need people like her." And Dad come over to my house and told me, and I said, "No, I'll give that a miss." And anyhow, we lost the contract for the airport canteen, and so I was out of a job. So I went down and they said, "Oh, put in the application." I said, "All right." So I applied for a couple of positions within the Aboriginal organisations, and I got the one at the Aboriginal Legal Service as a clerk, filing clerk. And about 6 months later, I became the administration officer because the girl that was in that position had left. And then 6 months after that, I became the CEO. So I was the CEO from 1980 to 2015. So 37 years I spent at the legal service. So just being able to see what sort of offences that are occurring back then, because I joined the legal service to make sure that people were aware of their rights. But today, people are getting rights taken off them, and that's not the idea of living a quality of life. And when I went to a couple of discussions over what's happening in town, we don't need to have our rights taken off us. We fought for rights to live a quality of life and as equals, not for one group of people to have over other groups of people. And they all say that, Australia is a lucky country. Yes, we are. And we've got to appreciate, and all we've been doing lately is talking down the town. No, let's talk to the people that are disrupting our way of life and the quality of life. So we've all got to get quite serious about this and not just leave it to 2 or 3 to put their hand up, because quite often people say, "Oh, bypass Alice Springs." But we know, we live here, we love this town, and it's our country, and we want to appreciate what we've got. But we don't want to be frightened of 10-year-old kids either, And I go up to the ATM and I see a young white girl there, and I see about 5 kids near her. So I walk over and I said, "Excuse me, dear." I said, "Do you know these children?" "No." I said, "Well, they're going to rob you as soon as you take money out. So don't take money out. You can go to the inside Coles and get money or come back with someone. But don't take it now because they will take your money." I said, "I can understand the language and I know what they're planning." So, "Well, thanks very much." So away she goes. So I waited a while, then I go to the ATM and there's 2 kids that come right up beside me. And I said to them, "Mparntwe, you kids get away." And they said, "Oh, we just want to see what numbers you're punching in." I said, "What?" "We just want to know what you're putting in there." I said, "No, you're not. Go on, get." And anyhow, as I walked away, there's a girl standing up near one of the signs there, and she's singing out, "Excuse me." And I turned around, "You know where Auntie Carly is?" She knew one of my nieces. And I said, "What are you doing?" And she comes from country northeast of here. "What are you doing?" She said, "I don't know them." She said, "I just walked along because I saw you." I said, "Well, you better get out of here because the police will come soon. I'm going to ring the police." And so away they went. But people get accosted on a daily basis. One lady had a whole bag of oranges taken out of her trolley. As the kids were running past, they just took it and ran. And I said, "Are you going to do anything about that?" And she said, "I'll go and get some more oranges," rather than go through all the filling in the forms and telling the police and, being that. She said, "What's a bag of oranges?" So, we've really got to think deeply about where we live and what's happening today. But what I'd like to do now is, any questions for Mr. Liddle? I think I've talked enough.
A couple of points back. Tony, I was privileged in 1952 to attend the wedding of your lost uncle Alfie at Garden Point. He married Geraldine Cusack, and he we signed him up to play football for St Mary's in the Darwin competition, and he was quite advisedly named Bulldozer.
Yeah.
He was tremendous, a lovely man all round. But I'd like to ask if either or both of you would give us an indication of the important role that your dad played with D.D. Smith in and around Alice Springs and the first Legislative Council and things like that, because of his incredible knowledge of all the local languages. Your dad built it.
Yeah, the first time anybody had heard Aboriginal language spoken on ABC radio was Dad interpreting for DD. And I remember going to school and all the kids had come up and said, "That was your father talking on the radio." And I said, "No, it wasn't." "Yes, it was, because D.D. Smith can't speak language." And I used to say, "That was Mr. Smith," because Dad said, "Don't tell anybody that's me interpreting. Tell them it's D.D. talking." But they knew it was Dad's voice. And he did play a major role in getting the message out on whatever Mr. Smith was saying as far as getting elected into the Legislative Assembly. And later on in years where he did some work for the Labor Party as well. But also he was called into quite infamous legal cases where he was interpreting for Aboriginal people. And that's when they first had him go down for the Max Stewart trial in Adelaide. And he was away for weeks on end at that trial. And so it's historical that Mr. Stewart was locked up for some 28 years. It was never proven that he actually committed that horrific crime, but he was definitely incarcerated for it. So, he became an interpreter. And on a Monday, if you recall, Ted, they used to often pick up people who were drunk and they'd go to court on the Monday at the old courthouse, and the line of all the defendants would go right down the corner of the mall where the Stewart Arms was. And I'd walk to the post office from work and get in the post office where Elders GM is now. And they'd all sing out, "Pat, Pat, get your father, get your father." And I was thinking, mobile phone didn't exist in those days, but if anybody saw him, they say, "Oh, you wanted down the courthouse." So between his own job and his own work, he'd often go and interpret for people on the side of the street. And, lots of other things he did without thinking twice about it. But you're right, Ted, he was quite influential because he lived in two worlds and understood both of them. Yeah.
You've inherited some good genes.
Yeah. Thank you. But, from Mum, when Dad was talking, when Tony was talking about Mum, she didn't have a good command of English. She spoke her language and 3 or 4 others from this area, including Rucha from the station. But never once did we ever hear Mum raise her voice or her hand. She just told you what to do and we did it. And we never ever answered Dad back. He was the law of the family, so we had very good guidance from both of them because they'd been when Tony spoke of Dad being taken, it was Grandpa who was working down at Deep Well with Johansson family, and the police went down there to pick the children up. And he said, "No, I'll take my children into the bungalow facility." So he brought him in on the wagon, and there was Dad's oldest sister, Auntie Hilda, and Dad and Uncle Harold at the time. And he brought him into the bungalow, which was where the car park of the Plaza Hotel shopping centre is. That was the first bungalow there before they went up to the one north of town. And then they were left there right up until they were farmed out at 15 to work on cattle stations. And also they couldn't, as Tony's saying, they couldn't rejoin Dad until they were 21. So they were really confined and were wards of the state. Yeah, so people lived tough lives, but they got on with it, yeah.
come in and take any one of them away from there. So he said when he wrote the letters in, and they wrote letters back to him, that they couldn't take him away because they didn't pay anything towards their education. Well, they only went to grade 4 and that. But why they had to shift him to somebody else instead of back to their father, I don't know, because old Grandpa Liddle was out there on his own and he treated them very well. And, you know, when they were small, and then tried to get them back all the time. And even after they got him back, Dad said that he never saw him until after he was 21, after he'd left the north side of here, working on the cattle stations. And he just happened to see him when he was working at Lackman Agency here. Dad was. He was doing runs. He was one of the first drivers to drive from Alice Springs to Tennant Creek, delivering some fuel up there. And he always said that it took him 5 days to go up there because of all the creeks and everything, getting bogged in creeks and everything. And on the way, he said it took me 5 days to get up there and 3 days to get back. So that's how hard it was, that I used to listen to all these little stories that he wasn't telling me, he was talking amongst other people. But at that age, I was about 7 or 8 years old, and I used to take all these things in. And I didn't realise that I still had it in there, unless somebody talks about something, and I tell them what I heard my father say. So he was pretty good, and he was good to me, and he always told me, you know, I shouldn't have to show you how to do things. Just keep an eye on what I'm doing. And, you know, I'll get this and get that. And when I got into transport and works in those places, because all the drivers there, they just drove, they couldn't fix anything. They broke down in the middle of nowhere. They just waited then until somebody came along, or somebody had to go out looking for them, works and housing and that. Well, I started pulling things apart and putting them back together when I broke down. And they said, oh, we're not allowed to do that. I said, well, I'm not sitting here for the weekend. And I'd fix it up. And, you know, and Desi McRae and all them. Desi McRae was a good operator on just about everything. I don't know whether you know him, the McRae family. And he came out of the army, and that's all he did was looking after machinery. But the people that were there, they had mechanics and everything, and as soon as something goes wrong, they got a bloke there straight away to fix it. And what I was going to say about those kids too that you were talking about, you know, the kids running amok in town and all that sort of thing, and how much the town has changed since we were kids, you know. Now, I can understand what these kids are doing here now, running around, running amok. We don't like it either, because this is where we belong, and all you people that belong, everybody's got a chance of, you know, staying here and living. But these young kids, back when I carted rations out to the missions in the 50s, Hearts Bluff, all those places, all those kids would run over and give you a hand unloading the stuff and everything and laughing and talking about things. They were really good kids. But to give them that, allowed to go, you know, what do you call it? Anyway, they all become citizens then. And it was a bit too soon before all those kids learned all the things about coming into town and behaving themselves, because once that started, and the old women, the old grandmothers especially, that looked after those kids, they told all the stories about what you can do and what you can't do. They don't see that anymore, because the old grandmother sort of left behind. And the men that were working, they lost their job because there was that many people coming into the territory and all over the place, and people from south and all over the place. And they were employed, and a lot of the Aboriginal people weren't employed, and they went on to dole and all that sort of thing. So that's what created that problem about them not being able to work. People say, oh, you know, why don't they get a job? Why don't they do this? Well, they can't get a job. Nobody wants to employ them. I did that a couple of times myself here after I left Ian Lovegrove out there. I tried to get a job and just said, oh, no, we haven't got nothing to do. We haven't got, you know, they tell you, nobody knew who I was. But this is getting to know people, you know. But that's how it was with those little kids. Anyway, I finally got through with everything, only because there were Aboriginal men working there, the transport and works, the older blokes, because a lot of them came out of the bungalow here before they got into work. But they were onto just about every government section in town, the Aboriginal people that were in the bungalow here in the thing, you know, and they let them go. But once they started to get too old, no Aboriginal people were employed after that, unless you were really well educated and you know. So I was just a truck driver, but I stayed there for 31 years. But I still had a lot of problems with the men that worked there. You know, it was very hard. But it didn't worry me in that way. Dad said, "Don't worry about anything. If you get into trouble, just have your say, but don't cause trouble." So it didn't worry me that much. Once he was a pretty wise old man, old Dad, you know, and all the things that he learnt from his father after he went down to Angus Downs. And he said to me one day, he said, what, you know, he said, I learned all the things about my father and the whole things that they got together. When that bloke that came through there, I saw a strange land. Jimmy, you remember that one? The book. And they went through, he came through there, and there was Dad, Uncle Arthur, and they sat down and had a talk to him, and it's written in the book there about how they were trying to get Aboriginal people to work and live together, like, you know. And that was good. And, you know, like the way things went, I'm starting to get it mumbled up here now. So yeah, just that sort of thing, like mixing together, not mixing together all the time, but get to know each other is the main thing. Get to know each other and do something about, you know, instead of getting into trouble like those kids were. You know, I just can't believe it. The way it was like I say, they got their rights to come into Alice Springs, where in Aboriginal time they weren't allowed in. Like there's only place for Araluen people, not all the others are right around you. They had to give up a smoke signal or something, and if you gave up a smoke signal, then they were allowed in. If you don't put up a smoke signal, you don't come in here. That sort of thing. But now there's everybody in town, and they don't care. They got no boundaries. They got nothing where they're taught by their grandmothers to stay away from this and stay away from that. I used to walk from here down to the bungalow with my grandmother in the creek in the weekends or something, you know. We'd walk right along the creek there until we see Aboriginal Araluen people in the creek. And we'd sit down and talk to them. Old granny would sit down and talk to them for a while and tell all the stories and everything. But you don't see that anymore, grandmother telling you what to do. I learnt everything from her. Don't do this, don't touch that. Because I went up to a gum tree there that had billy cans and swags and things that are hanging on the tree. And while old granny was walking along, I ran over to this tree and just went to touch one of those things, and she growled at me like hell. Don't touch those things, she said. Somebody will come chasing you, and then they'll catch you up until they get that thing off you. And I said, how are they going to know I touched it? They'll see your track and follow your track, right? I never touched anything again. So, yeah. All right.
One question, Tony. How long did it take you to go from Mayor's Rock to Dockaroo with a full load? On that road?
That was a terrible road then. We went right out to Giles too and places. Well, we got bogged in that Giles Creek there before we got to the, what's the name? Yeah, it was pretty rough going along because, you know, corrugations, and there were only two-wheel tracks then when we first went out there. It was the Giles 1950, or I forget what date it was now, but we took some machinery out there and workers to go out and do the airstrip. That was in 1956, I think it was, when I left, when I went out there, yeah. But all those things, when you got to tie all that stuff up with chains and everything, and you can feel the thing when the truck starts to move or not bouncing properly, then you know there's a chain loose, so you had to stop and tighten it all up. Yeah, it's hard work, especially trying to load one of those on your own. And Dickie Bella, they'd say, oh, don't worry about taking somebody with you. He said, they'll be out there in the camp. By the time you get to the camp, this is on a Monday, you drive out there and they've already taken off somewhere else. There's nobody left there. So I took a bungie, I took him with me once. And no, good thing, they were going to take over the truck. And I went out to show him how to operate it and all sorts of things. And when he seen all the machinery laying around, and at times I had to go and do that myself, whereas he was with me on this trip. And, showed him how to chain everything up. And it was a good job, though, but, you had to do it. Otherwise, there were a couple of drivers there that lost machinery. If the chain breaks or something like that and you don't feel that thing bouncing around, then the machine or whatever you got on the back will fall off. So that happened a couple of times with other drivers. But old Dad always said, you don't have to rush into everything. He said, make sure everything is right before you go. That was it, yeah. So he was the best teacher I ever had, Dad. I didn't realise that until I started to go in and working for somebody else and doing things with other people. Because everybody else grumbles and groans and they say something, but he just tells you straight out and that's it. And we all took a notice of him. Thank you, yeah.
I just want to end up by singing the praises of a lot of part Aboriginal people at the time, with Tony and my husband David at the works and the water resources. They put a lot of work and effort into their employment, and they were part of the economy for many, many years. But also, the Aboriginal women that ran the Alice Springs Hospital were the people who worked in the laundry, the people who worked in the kitchen, and the people who worked on the wards. Were nearly all the women that lived down at the cottages, who were the matriarchs of a lot of people that are living in town now. And those women were a workforce that was sort of very dedicated to their, you could eat off the kitchen floor. The kids got fed when they went to school and they had no lunch. They'd go down to the hospital laundry. All the mothers were working there and they'd always have something to eat. So it was sort of like a shared economy where all the aunties were your mothers as well. One day I thought I'd go down there and get something to eat, and they said, you don't belong, you don't live at the cottages. So they didn't give me anything. And so I was trying to claim them, then I spotted my auntie. And she said, what are you looking for? I said, Auntie June, I just want something to eat. She said, come on, bub, come in. And they said, oh, yeah, this is my daughter. So from then on, I can go anywhere. But just passing all that sort of energy from those ladies, they had employment. So now when people go to employ for a job, they've got to hop through all the boxes, tick all the boxes. They don't take people on face value. I am a hard worker, please employ me. Takes you a long time to get a position in town. And a lot of people, they never ever are on a long contract, it's short-term contracts for many people. So I think, with the Aboriginal affairs the way it is now, I've got a group of nieces over there that have just started their own business, and they're looking at having their own consultancy, especially around youth and about the culture of the town and their culture as well, passing on their knowledge. So I'm going to support them 100% and talk to people about them. And I've engaged them on a couple of other jobs that I've got around town. So, yeah, good. I think that's enough from us. I'm sure we're running out of time. But one thing I'd like to say is I'd like to sing the praises of my husband. I've been involved in a lot of committees over the years, and one of the ones that I was involved in for something like 8 years was the women's shelter. And we had an old nurse's demountable dropped on a pile of sand right near the swimming pool. and it was dilapidated, and they had a few barbed wires strewn along the fence. And there was me and Margaret Gaff and Margaret Waite and Joyce Bowden and a couple other ladies on the committee. And we'd often meet down there at 6 in the evening and go through to about 7. And quite often irate husbands would, sing out to me to get their wives out of there, and what am I doing, locking them up, and quite obnoxious behaviour. But I had one man behind me which stood really strong, and that was my husband. And he didn't have to be in town. He just put the word out. My wife's on that committee. Don't anybody try to harass or bother her. And I walked around in peace. And I was thinking, and he used to say to my sons, they said, "Where's Mum gone?" "Oh, she's gone to Fort Knox." He's always heard the woman sent Fort, but I'm glad I was able to be in that position. A lot of other women weren't. To be able to say, I've got strong brothers behind me, but I had one strong husband who looked after us and made sure our welfare was paramount. And he was one of those hard-working men, like Tony, that used to go out on weeks on end, do the drilling, come back, and then the kids would say, "Dad, can we go bush?" And he'd get himself taken bush. And he just finished 6 weeks in the scrub, and yet he still had time to do that with the sons and our sons' mates. And that's, we lost him 3 years ago, but it's like he's here today. So I'd just like to sing his praises because he was a wonderful person who really thought and cared about a lot of people, including his own immediate family, brothers and sisters. And, when we lose somebody like that, it's a real big hole that's been left. But the memories are absolutely really wonderful. So I'd just like to leave on that note, that if you've got somebody supporting you, you can do anything. And I counted up how many committees I'd been on for 20 years, and there was something like 68, unbelievable. And I said, did I do all that? But that's having a strong person behind you and strong family behind you. So thank you very much. Thanks.